Good afternoon, Southminster scholars. It's January 1690. We're in Salem, Massachusetts. It's brutally cold, and things are not well in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter and her 11-year-old cousin are acting strangely, to say the least. They are barking like dogs. They are diving under furniture. They are contorting as if seized with pain, and they are babbling nonsensically. What could it be but the devil loose in Salem? Thus began the community hysteria that led to the Salem witchcraft trials. When it died down 18 months later, more than 140 people would have been accused. Dozens will languish in rudimentary jails for all that time. At least 25 lie dead, 19 by hanging, 5 by dying in jail of cold and illness, and 1 by torture. A man named Giles Corey absolutely refused to plead to the ridiculous charge at the arraignment and was subjected to a form of torture in which the accused is pressed down beneath an increasing load of more and more heavy stones in an effort to make him enter a plea. Well, he continued to refuse until the weight of the stones crushed him to death. I'll let Professor Linder lead us through this hard-to-comprehend hysteria and the gruesome outcomes, but in it, watch for the children's beginning to supply names of women who they said allegedly bewitched them. Watch for the arraignment of the first 3 women that the children charged. Watch how certain birthmarks on them were considered marks of the devil, witch marks. Watch for how it might have blown over were it not for Tituba, an Indian slave who was one of the 3 initially accused. At first, she denied any guilt, as did the other 2. But then she began to sense that being an Indian and a slave, the other 2 might turn on her, and so she in turn turned on them, deflecting the blame on them. And her fabricated revelations served to silence the skeptics, and the witch hunt was on. Watch for the ever-expanding circle of accusations, beginning to range even outside of Salem. Watch for the actual trials, in which gossip, hearsay, complete fabrications, utter imagination, were admitted as evidence of guilt. Watch for how the lust of blood began fading as reason and sanity slowly began to return as to what had been done here. Watch for the period of atonement that followed. Watch for the release of the surviving accused witches, some in terrible shape from languishing in prison. And finally, watch for the judges turning on each other and blaming each other for what had happened. One of them finally did issue a formal apology, and after he did that, most jurors came forth and admitted that they were the ones who had been sadly deluded and mistaken.
It's January 1692 in Salem Village, Massachusetts. Things are not well in the home of village minister Samuel Parris. Samuel's 9-year-old daughter Betty and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams are acting strangely. The girls dash about, dive under furniture, bark like dogs, fall dumb, contort in pain, babble nonsense, and complain of fever. To the shock of her father, Betty throws a Bible across the room. Abigail launches herself into the air and makes flying noises. Things get even more alarming. Other girls nearby begin to behave in odd but similar ways. 4, then 5, then 6 afflicted girls. What on earth is happening? Is this a bizarre, contagious affliction? Or is it possibly the sign of something else? The devil, perhaps? We all know where this story takes us. There will be accusations of witchcraft, then more accusations of witchcraft. The hysteria will not end until 19 men and women are carted to Gallows Hill and hanged. Another man of over 80 years will be pressed to death under heavy stones after he refuses to submit to trial. Between 100 and 200 people will face accusations of witchcraft. Dozens will languish in jail for months without trials. Some will die there. Then, almost as soon as it began, it'll be over. For us, the question is, why this travesty of justice occurred? Nothing about it was inevitable. The Salem tragedy owed itself to a series of unfortunate events, to a Puritan understanding of an active and devious devil, to an ongoing frontier war, to trying economic conditions, to congregational strife, to teenage rebellion and boredom, and to personal jealousies. There is no simple explanation. What happened after the girls of Salem Village began exhibiting strange behavior is this. A neighbor of Reverend Parris, Mary Sibley, proposed a form of countermagic to the Parris's family slave, John. Sibley told John to bake a rye cake containing Betty's and Abigail's urine and to feed it to the family dog. Why a dog? Well, dogs, it was thought, were used as witches, by witches as agents to carry out their devilish commands. The cake might draw the witch to the animal, perhaps even transfer the witch's spell to it. Well, nice try, but it didn't work. The witch cake experiment infuriated Reverend Parris. He publicly reproached Sibley for bringing counter magic into his parsonage. He called it going to the devil for help against the devil. Parris preferred to rely on prayer. But when prayer didn't work, he turned to a local physician named William Griggs and to another minister, John Hale. Hale and Griggs diagnosed the problem. It was witchcraft. The widespread belief that witches targeted children supported their conclusion. Neither Hale nor Griggs nor anyone else in Salem doubted that Satan was real or that he acted in the world. The devil sowed disease and bad fortune. He orchestrated natural catastrophes. By late February, 12-year-old Ann Putnam and Elizabeth Hubbard, the 16-year-old niece of Dr. Griggs, were also choking, shuddering, contorting. Thomas Putnam pressed his daughter. Who do you blame for your behavior? Ann supplied 3 names, and then it began. With the prominent Putnam family supporting the hunt for witches, officials had to pay attention. Stacy Schiff, in her book The Witches, notes another influential cheerleader for the prosecutions was Cotton Mather. Mather saw the fact that the devil seemed to be taking a special interest in the goings-on around Salem as confirmation of his own belief in the exceptionalism of Massachusetts. There is a reason the devil is focusing his recruiting efforts here. The busyness of witches also suggested to Mather that the end time was drawing near, in line with his own views. On February 29th, Thomas Putnam and 3 friends rode from Salem Village to Salem Town to formally charge 3 women with witchcraft. Acting on the complaint, the constable arrested Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, an Indian slave working in Reverend Parris's parsonage. All 3 were ordered to appear the next morning before 2 justices of the peace. Curious farmers crowded into the pews of the village meeting house. 2 justices of the peace sat at a table in front of the pulpit. Justice of the Peace, John Hathorne, wasted no time getting down to business. Sarah Good, he asked, what evil spirit do you have familiarity with? None, she answered. But Hathorne had made up his mind about her guilt. He asked her young accusers to rise. Was this the woman who hurt you? Yes, they all answered. When Good denied attacking the girls, each girl twisted and contorted as if electricity were pulsing through their bodies. Hathorne drew what seemed to be the obvious conclusion. Sarah Good, do you not see what you have done? Tell us the truth. Why do you torment these children? This then becomes the pattern for many of the examinations that follow. Sarah Good, aged 38, lived on the fringe of Salem society. She was caustic, a beggar, a social misfit. Even her husband didn't have anything positive to say about her. He called her, his wife, an enemy of all that is good. In many ways, even if she wasn't one, Good would have made a pretty good witch. She was an obvious candidate for the girl's accusations. And so was a second woman named as a witch, Sarah Osborne. Osborne was old, quarrelsome, and had not attended church in over a year. Hathorne asked the girls to approach Osborne and identify her as the person who had strangled and pinched them. He peppered her with questions like, why have you yielded so far as to the devil as to not go to church? Other villagers came forward to offer their suspicions. The magistrates heard stories of cheese and butter mysteriously gone bad, and of animals born with deformities, all after visits by one or the other of the suspects. In the common practice of the time, the magistrates asked the same questions of each suspect over and over. Were they witches? Had they seen Satan? How, if they were not witches, did they explain the girl's contortions? How did they account for the ruined butter or the deformed calf? The day after their examinations, both Good and Osborne were undressed and closely inspected all over by the wife of a Salem innkeeper. Moles and birthmarks were considered witches' marks, places on the body where the devil leaves his sign that the person is now under his command. The third suspect, named by Ann Putnam, was the Indian maid of Reverend Paris, Tituba. Interestingly, Tituba was not initially accused by Abigail and Betty, who lived with her every day. And Tituba would supply the real drama of the day. Now let's step back for a minute and try to make sense of what's going on. Betty Paris and Abigail Williams set the hysteria in motion with their bizarre behavior. Why them? We don't know for sure, but theories abound. For example, in an article published in Science magazine, Linda Caporio argues that the girls suffered from convulsive ergotism, an affliction caused by eating rye infested with a fungus. Convulsive ergotism causes violent fits, a crawling sensation on the skin, vomiting, choking, and most interestingly, hallucinations. The hallucinogenic drug, LSD, is a derivative of ergot. But there are problems with this theory. It cannot, for example, explain the affliction suffered by others in Salem later in the year when the conditions weren't right for a rye infestation. Now, the actual cause of the behavior was probably something else. Stress, guilt, child abuse, epilepsy, and delusional psychosis have all been suggested. Adolescent boredom and rebellion might have had a lot to do with it. The theory seized upon in 1692, however, was witchcraft. And just 3 years earlier, Cotton Mather had published a book widely read throughout Puritan Massachusetts called Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions. In his book, Mather described the suspected witchcraft of an Irish washerwoman in Boston. Mather concluded Memorable Providences with this thought: I am resolved after this never to use but just one grain of patience with any man that shall impose upon me a denial of devils or of witches. I shall count him downright impudent if he assert the non-existence of things which we have had such palpable convictions of. Betty's behavior in many ways mirrored that of the washerwoman described in Mather's book. It was easy to believe in 1692 in Salem, with an Indian war raging less than 70 miles away, that the devil was close at hand. Sudden and violent death had become common and was on every mind. But getting back to Tituba, it's possible the whole matter might have ended with admonishments, were it not for her performance. First, she denied any guilt, but then, sensing that she might become a scapegoat, Tituba confessed. At the same time, though, she tried to deflect most of the blame to others. She claimed that she was approached by a tall man from Boston, Satan, we guess, who asked her to sign in his book and to do his work. Yes, Tituba declared, she was a witch. In fact, she and 4 other witches, including Good and Osborne, had flown through the air on their poles. But she was a reluctant witch. When Good and Osborne ordered her to kill Thomas Putnam's son, she tried to run to Reverend Parris for counsel, but the devil blocked her path. And when Tituba resisted Sarah Good's demand that she torture girls in Parris's home, she was struck deaf. Now you can imagine how jaw-dropping these revelations must have seemed. Stacy Schiff writes the effect of the confession was, quote, as if Tituba had handed out hallucinogens. Before long, others will join Tituba in describing their own late-night broom rides, encounters with yellow birds, wolves, long-nosed hairy creatures with wings. Schiff writes, from Tituba on down, the testimony is all bluebirds and canaries, yellow dogs, red rats, red meat, red bread, red books. I'll quote just a small portion of the transcript from Tituba's examination to give you a flavor of it. Where did you go? Up to Mr. Putnam's, and he make me hurt the child. Who did make you go? Man that is very strong, and these 2 women, Good and Osborne. But I'm sorry. How did you go? What did you ride upon? I ride upon a stick or pole, and Good and Osborne ride beside me. We ride, taking hold of one another. I don't know how far we go, for I saw no trees nor path, but was presently there. Now, Tituba's confession made her a central figure in the prosecutions. Her confession also silenced most skeptics. The authorities were on the right track. Witch hunting had become an obsession. Soon the afflicted girls made new accusations. They reported that the spectral forms of 4 additional women attacked them. During a March church service, Ann Putnam shouted out, look where Goodwife Cloyce sits, on the beam, suckling her yellow bird between her fingers. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of an accused witch, Sarah Good, became the first child to be accused of witchcraft. 3 girls claimed to have been bitten by Dorothy's specter. The plight of Dorothy had to be the saddest of the Salem tragedies. The little girl was arrested and kept in jail for 8 months. She watched her mother get carried off to the gallows. She cried her heart out, and she went insane. Meanwhile, the number of girls afflicted continued to grow, rising to 7. Historian Peter Hoffer describes the girls as a band of attention seekers. In his words, the girls turned themselves from a circle of friends into a gang of juvenile delinquents. The accusing girls developed ever more polished performances for ever larger audiences. Stuck in jail, suspects learned that confessions could be a way to avoid the gallows. Confessing witches became witnesses, not defendants. So women like Deliverance Hobbs stepped forward to tell magistrates that she pinched girls at the devil's command, went joyriding on poles, and attended a gathering of witches in an open field near Salem. Jails approached capacity. People were being named witches right and left, more than 140 in all. And not just in Salem Village, but a couple of dozen nearby Massachusetts towns and villages as well. The colony was teetering on the brink of chaos. When Governor William Phips returned from England, he decided fast action was needed. So Phips created a 7-judge court called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, literally the court that hears and decides. It would take up the witchcraft cases. The court included several close friends of Cotton Mather. The Chief Justice, the most influential member of the court, was a gung-ho witch hunter named William Stoughton. A quorum of 5 judges sat for each trial session. Stoughton and the other judges agreed to accept confessions as credible. On other questions, the court looked to ministers for guidance. The judges generally lacked legal training, so why not consult the witchcraft experts? They decided to allow the so-called touch test. In this form of evidence, an accused witch was asked to touch the afflicted person. And if her touch caused the afflicted person's contortions to stop, well, the reason must be that she's a witch. The judges also gave a green light to physical examinations to search for witch marks. And most importantly, they accepted, even encouraged, spectral evidence. That is, testimony by a witness that a defendant's specter had attacked him, even while the defendant, him or herself, maybe maintained a physical presence elsewhere. Evidence that we would exclude from modern courtrooms: hearsay, gossip, stories, unsupported assertions, surmises, all that was omitted. Protections that modern defendants take for granted were missing. Accused witches had no legal counsel, could not call witnesses to testify under oath on their behalf, and had no formal avenues of appeal. Defendants could, however, speak for themselves. They could produce evidence, and they could cross-examine their accusers. The court convened for the first time on June 2, 1692 in Salem town. Technically, Salem Village was a part of Salem town on the northern outskirts, but as we'll see, the two locales had very different profiles. The first accused witch to come to trial was a woman named Bridget Bishop. Bishop was 60 years old and owned a tavern where patrons drank cider ale and played shuffleboard, even on the Sabbath. She feuded with neighbors, and she paid her bills slowly, if at all. In other words, Bishop was a societal outlier, a prime candidate for an accusation of witchcraft. Thomas Newton, the special prosecutor, likely selected Bishop for his first prosecution because he believed a stronger case could be made against her than any of the other accused witches. During the trial, a field hand testified that he saw Bishop's specter steal eggs and then transform herself into a cat. Confessed witch Deliverance Hobbs testified that Bishop was one of them, and a villager named Samuel Gray told the court that Bishop visited his bed at night and tormented him. Wishful thinking, perhaps. Meanwhile, a jury of matrons assigned to examine Bishop's body reported that they found an excrescence of flesh, a place where her familiar might have sucked. Several girls testified that Bishop's specter afflicted them, and other villagers claimed that Bishop was responsible for various miseries that they had suffered. One witness, for example, testified that Bishop was transported under guard to the Salem meeting house, and there they saw her stare at a building, and that caused a part of the building to fall to the ground. Now, by modern standards, of course, this evidence is laughable, but as causes and effects were understood in 1692, it was anything but. Bishop's jury returned a verdict of guilty. But not everyone who participated in the trial was satisfied. One of the judges was so aghast at the conduct of the trial that he resigned from the court. Chief Justice Stoughton had no reservations. He signed Bishop's death warrant. And on June 10, 1692, Bishop was carted to Gallows Hill and hanged, the first victim of the Salem witchcraft trials. As the summer of 1692 warmed, the pace of trials picked up. Not all defendants were as disreputable as Bridget Bishop. Rebecca Nurse, for example, was a pious, respected woman. Yet Nurse's specter, according to Ann Putnam Jr. and Abigail Williams, attacked them. Ann Putnam Sr. testified that Nurse demanded that she sign the Devil's Book. There was a lot of talk about signing the Devil's Book in these trials. Book signing was a ritual. It was widely believed to be the first step in joining the devil's forces. Now, why these accusations against Nurse, a respected church-goer? By early autumn, Salem's lust for blood ebbed. When accusations of witchcraft were made against powerful and well-connected people like the wife of Governor Phipps, they pushed back. Reverend John Hale became a skeptic. It cannot be imagined that in a place of so much knowledge, so many and so small compass of land should abominably leap into the devil's lap at once. The educated elite of the colony began working to end the witch hunting. Increase Mather, the father of cotton, publishes Cases of Conscience. It's been called the first American tract on evidence. In the work, Mather argued that, quote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person should be condemned." Samuel Willard, a highly regarded Boston minister, circulated a piece called Some Miscellany Observations on Our Present Debates Respecting Witchcrafts. Willard suggested that the devil might create the specter of an innocent person. In fact, wasn't that just the sort of devious trick the devil might try? Mathers and Willard's works caught the attention of Governor Phipps. The governor ordered the Salem court to exclude spectral evidence and touching tests and insisted on proof of guilt by clear and convincing evidence. With spectral evidence excluded, almost all the subsequent witchcraft trials ended in acquittals. In May of 1693, Phipps released from prison all remaining accused or convicted witches. Salem's nightmare was over. The period of atonement that followed the release of the surviving accused witches began with Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, when he issued a public confession of guilt and apology. Jurors came forward to say that they were sadly deluded and mistaken in their judgments. Even Reverend Samuel Parris conceded some errors of judgment. Governor Phipps blamed the entire affair on Chief Justice William Stoughton. But Stoughton, for his part, refused to apologize or explain himself. He attacked Phipps for interfering just when he was about to, quote, clear the land of witches. So what should we make of the Salem witchcraft trials? What catalyzed and sustained the hysteria? Scholars seek patterns. They look, for example, for telling differences between the accused and the accusers. Scholars have noted that most of the accused, except for those charged early on, were better off financially than most of the accusers. In a number of cases, accusing families gained confiscated property following the convictions of the accused witches. There's another difference between the accusers and the accused. The two groups generally took opposite sides in the congregational schism that had split the Salem community before the outbreak of the hysteria. Most of those accused of witchcraft had been supporters of former minister George Burroughs. On the other hand, the families that included the accusers had, for the most part, played leading roles in ousting Burroughs from his ministry. The evidence is compelling. Property disputes and congregational feuds both played major roles in determining who lived and who died. Scholars also note that Salem Village in 1692 was in the midst of change. A mercantile elite was beginning to develop. Salem was an increasingly class-divided village. Clans competed for control of the village and the pulpit. A debate raged over how independent Salem Village, tied to its agriculture, should be from Salem Town, the center of a sea trade. The witchcraft trials settled scores. For the witchcraft trials to have occurred, there had to have been a perfect storm of forces. And in 1692, there was. After 1692, Massachusetts never executed another witch. The trials undermined Puritan orthodoxy and contributed in the next generation to the rise of Anglicans, Baptists, and other more tolerant brands of Christianity. One other thought, the Salem witchcraft trials were unusual in that many of the key actors, the accusers and the accused, were female. Mothers, daughters, wives, and servants. Women played lead roles in this historical drama. The Salem witchcraft trials are history, but witch hunting in America did not end in Salem. We will see witch hunting in the 1950s, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. Of course, there is a distinction. There were no witches, but there were communists. We will see a form of witch hunting in the late 1980s when daycare providers across the country faced accusations of child abuse. Each generation must learn the lessons of history or risk repeating its mistakes. Salem is a cautionary tale. It reveals the danger of drawing conclusions ahead of the evidence and of dispensing with the rules of evidence and fair procedure that can save us from rushing to judgment. The story of Salem has value even today. Stacy Schiff puts it this way: Salem endures not only as a metaphor, but as a vaccine and a taunt. It glares at us when fear paralyzes reason, when we overreact or overcorrect. Visitors to Salem today can see poignant reminders of 1692. On a monument marking the grave of Rebecca Nurse, the least excusable of all the convictions, are inscribed the words of John Greenleaf Whittier. O Christian martyr, who for truth could die, when all about thee owned the hideous lie, the world redeemed from superstition's sway is breathing freer for thy sake today. We can wish it were so.
A few takeaways for me. Witchcraft trials fortunately ended as such in 1693, but witch hunting is alive and well when we permit it to. Social outcasts, those different from us, make very convenient scapegoats. Witch hunts are wonderful for settling old grudges, old revenges, old scores. Periods of upheaval, of great change, of great uncertainty, make good climates for witch hunts. The Salem witch trials did much to tarnish the reputation of the Puritans because it exposed a religious zeal that knew no bounds and brooked on no dissension, no questioning. But perhaps the best lesson was Professor Linder's comment at the end that we hear over and over again from Professor Fears, that those who will not heed the lessons of the past are doomed to repeat them again and again. Well, observations, comments on QB, next week, the Boston Massacre trial, and thanks for coming today.